Whenever I see the type of development that the characters get as the series progress in some other capacity that isn't negative in some other way, I always think of this episode, All the Rage, but at the same time, knowing full well that after the episode, Clyde was this close to moving out of Royal Woods, it really feels like that they just can't be able to make any character realistic in these types of scenarios where everyone around them are basically just doing their own thing or just becoming yes man, or the fact that nothing really matters when the characters aren't defending themselves or making a stand for themselves for the right reasons. And what I mean by that is how this episode is difficult to go against anyone, all the while feeling the sympathy towards the characters like Clyde. And considering I managed to find Throwing Pains and La La Land from the Casagrandes that really feels like that they actually knew how to handle the main character and the group of friends correctly compared to All the Rage, it's finally a sign to relief that the Casagrandes is definitely getting a point over the Casagrandes, but I'm getting way ahead of myself. Lincoln and his friends learned that Clyde has anger problems and he's taking out his tempo against the dodgeball team because one of his favorite contestants in Desert Storm was caught cheating even though that he thinks otherwise. So, for the beginning of the first half of the episode, Lincoln and his friends took advantage of Clyde's anger in order to get past Dodgeball Week. In the Casagrandes episode Throwing Pains, due to being extremely cold outside, Ryan and her friends wanted to spend their time in the gym, but unfortunately, dodgeball is happening and there are no experts in dodgeball. Considering that Girl Jordan is an expert at dodgeball while Ryan isn't, and I'm pretty sure we never saw one scene involving Ryan doing any dodgeball during her days with being with Lincoln in Royal Woods Elementary School. It actually made me admire the struggles that she's dealing with in this episode. But for the Loud House All the Rage episode, on the other hand, what I said earlier, I meant every single word, and that's not even scratching the surface. And no, I'm not talking about the scene where Zach's voice was into Liam's voice, because as far as I'm concerned, it's the least of the episode's problems. Look, I'm fully aware that what Clyde is going through in this episode was mainly him being upset over things that instantly gets to him, and I can totally understand that myself included have went through these scenarios. However, when it comes to the execution, it really feels difficult to take his character seriously when he's being used as a tool for the majority of the episode. And when it comes to Lincoln and his friends getting into Clyde's head by mentioning him of what happened on that night during his time watching Desert Storm, I can totally understand onto why they deserve to be blamed and not the most likable characters in all this, but considering of how the system of how everything works in this episode, it really feels difficult to understand the problems of what the characters have, even though that Clyde ended up becoming the most likable character in this entire episode. And it's not because of his most noticeable rage moments. When it came to the Casagrandes characters, they're basically doing everything right while the characters, mainly Lincoln's friends, are doing wrong. Trust me when I say this, when these characters have no experience in dodgeball and yet they ended up becoming more likable characters even though they're not experts, is really saying something. Like, it's honestly interesting to see that we've come to a point that one of the episodes I didn't watch from the show, and when I got the chance to watch it, I managed to find these characters much more likable and a better dodgeball episode than All the Rage, which is really saying something because this episode came out before All the Rage. The pacing in this episode is done much more better, and when it came to the pacing of the Loud House, it's really difficult to understand of how the pacing is really causing so much happening in the span of 11 minutes. Like, as much as I can totally understand that it may take time for Clyde to get over his tempo issues after his experience of watching Desert Storm, I'm honestly starting to convince that what Link and his friends are doing in that episode were mainly out of desperation rather than making them unlikable, because unlike what they did on preventing Clyde to leave Royal Woods, they're into dodgeball a lot more than Ryan and her friends, and judging to the fact that they're dealing with this handicap against Gore Jordan's team, really feels like that they're not really capable of defeating Gore Jordan completely. Like, I need to be honest with you, I understand that these characters aren't the best when it comes to dodgeball, but considering that they're losing Clyde's rage in order to win at dodgeball, and the biggest reason to why they're dealing with dodgeball madness is because Mr. Bolhofner is in charge since one of the teachers is at a convention. The score system is a lot more difficult to understand, which is really saying something. Well, the Casagrandes score system, even though it may be off at some points, is a better score system than this. Seriously, how is Mr. Bolhofner still part of middle school? Seriously, how did he convince anyone to be in charge? Like, they didn't have any better ideas on having different substitute teachers? It just really feels like that they'll only rely on Mr. Bolhofner because none of the teachers or principals are tough like Mr. Bolhofner. I'm just gonna say this right now, there isn't a problem on having a tough person, but when you have a character like Mr. Bolhofner who is completely different in his Season 3 appearances, then I can't be able to take his character a lot more seriously since I've discussed him a lot in my Lincoln Loud video. And the fact that he is being latched on to Lincoln Loud for the majority of the episodes, it doesn't really change the fact that he ends up reverting back to his old ways. It's hard to feel sympathy involving a character that was part of the military. And don't even get me started on the fact that he managed to get the Viking team from Iceland, which are actual Vikings, to be in a dodgeball match against Lincoln's team. If you ask me, the fact that Vikings are canon to the Loud House universe, all the while that this episode is trying to remind you of the fact that Mr. Bolhofner is mostly responsible in all this, mostly schooled because of Lincoln's predicament, is really saying something that nothing moves forward at all in this show. And even when it does, it's not enough to make up anything that is the total opposite of progress. Anyway, when it comes to Dodge and her team in Throwing Pains, considering that they're really into dodgeball in the same ways as Gore Jordan and her team, or maybe in this case very aggressive, you can easily tell that they really love dodgeball to the point that their passion in dodgeball is being way more competitive against Ryan and her friends. Like, if Ryan and her friends can't be able to handle the snowy and cold temperatures outside, then they have to play by Dodge's rules. Mainly playing dodgeball no matter what. No questions asked, otherwise you will rather stay outside to enjoy the frozen temperatures. The odds of what Ryan's friends are dealing with are a lot more better compared to Lincoln's friends' odds. Believe me when I say this. It really shows that even if the score system is somewhat weirdly off in the Casagrandes, it's way more better compared to the Loud House's score system. I understand that score systems aren't supposed to be perfect, and I can understand that they're supposed to be setbacks, but when they're this over-exaggerated, I can't be able to get used to those, mainly from the Loud House. And when it comes to the Casagrandes, upon rewatching the episodes, it really shows that when they have this type of development that really works compared to the Loud House's All the Rage, I wonder what my life would have been like if I ever attended a school that is part of a huge city. Because let me tell you, I'm starting to convince that dysfunctionality is nowhere near as bad when a school is next to a big city or into a big city, knowing forward that there's so much that can easily be fixed with these types of environments. Granted, I could be wrong, but at the same time, knowing full well of how Throwing Pains' execution is better than All the Rage, I can only hope more if I ever had the chance to be part of a school that is in the big city. Getting back to Clyde in All the Rage, when it comes to some of the moments that doesn't have anything to do with Desert Storm, it really feels so out of place. Like, with this happening in the 6th season, it really feels off to have Clyde's friends just ignore putting their trash and trays away. And when it comes to the other moments where they try to make Clyde enrage again, are desperation. Mainly desperate into doing anything in order to make this episode work for the type of material that they're working with. Like, I can understand Rusty chewing gum in front of Clyde, which is really annoying, but when it came to Lincoln showing Clyde a picture of one of his pets wearing a Santa costume on Halloween and he overreacts, that really feels like the weakest way to have Clyde be that furious. Like, it's one thing to not dress appropriately for a holiday, but at the same time, The Nightmare Before Christmas is also a Halloween, but still Christmas film at the end of the day. Even though this has nothing to do with that film, that's literally the vibe I'm getting when it comes to seeing Clyde overreact, which does make sense, but at the same time, I just don't understand onto why it's that big of a deal. Here's the thing, Clyde may be the most likable character in this episode. His rage just instantly makes him a tool. That's the problem, is that whenever a character like Clyde ends up becoming likable, he ends up becoming a tool for the characters to work with. So sometimes, even if I may side with Clyde, not completely when he's mostly a tool, well, the majority of the episode where his friends are mainly just using him, and yet at the same time, when it comes to basically everything else in this episode, it doesn't really matter because they're not getting any consequences. And even when they get some consequences in other episodes or centering around other characters, it really feels forced for the wrong reasons, mainly in the taunting hour, and mainly at the fact that at this point, it's hard to take anything seriously, knowing forward that the characters are just being yes man most of the time. I'm just saying, I really found it a lot more annoying of how these characters aren't learning all the while that they're easily doing it, because it really feels so obvious that they're really out of character due to the writing department. Trust me when I say this. When it came to Throwing Pains from the Casagrandes, even though it may go overboard when it comes to being unrealistic, I have to admit, when these characters have no knowledge of dodgeball, unlike Lincoln and his friends, ends up having the better episode, just goes to show that there was some down-to-earth elements. Like, it may be rare to see down-to-earth elements that doesn't have fantasy elements, but when they are put into place for better execution, it really feels like you really root for these characters since that they know each other a lot more and not being dumbed down due to the writing department. As for Becky, who is Dodge's girlfriend, by the way, we're in the LGBT month. Granted, I'm not celebrating this month like I did last year, but just worth noting, is mainly a better version of Clyde from All the Rage. Look, I'm fully aware that Becky is one of the most unlikable characters from the spin-off, and it took me a while to finally get to her character. But the thing is, compared to Clyde, who only has wage problems for the first time that really feels somewhat understandable but somewhat off, you can instantly tell that she's having a blast with Dodgeball, and she is really aggressive. So I can instantly say that if you would put a Raging Clyde with this lunatic, it's honestly debatable on who would be superior. Like, I did have this idea that Clyde would have been better at Dodgeball than Becky, but at the same time, that's like saying Girl Jordan never existed, all because Clyde is superior because he is the master at Dodgeball for being in Rage. I'm just saying, like, if I want to see actual competition involving Becky, it would be up against Girl Jordan. Though then again, considering that Ryan's team ended up winning by grabbing the Dodgeball at full speed, it really feels like that there's a lot going on when it comes to Becky's surroundings. I'm just saying. I am fully aware that there's another episode involving her that she was at her worst, but considering that her motivations in this episode is better compared to Clyde's, is really saying something. Like, Clyde may be taking out his anger in Dodgeball, but at the same time, Becky is always in the zone because she's obsessed with Dodgeball. Which explains onto why the ending of All the Rage is really weak, because even when Lincoln and his friends apologize for causing so much trouble by placing wrappers or garbage in the outside of the front school or the back, Clyde is instantly disappointed, but at the same time he ended up using his rage to help out his friends at the end. Close friends, sure, but at the same time, I honestly don't even know what to think when it comes to these characters just ended up winning at the end, even though what they ended up doing throughout the majority of the episode was the opposite of what friends would do. Like, at this point, even if I understand that Clyde is mostly forgiving, even though that this isn't one of the worst things that his friends ever did to him, it just really feels like a forced way to wrap things up. And when it comes to Clyde's rage, I don't think we're ever going to see that rage after this episode. Believe me when I say this, knowing full well that we ended up getting this kind of development in Season 6 and it was poorly executed, I don't even think that Clyde would be able to beat Becky without his rage. In comparison of the Casagrandes episode, with it taking Dodgeball legitimately, I really admit that it really did a good job, especially the ending where Ryan and Becky and Dodge make amends so that they can actually do their own thing inside of the gym. In fact, the only thing that this episode teach me is the fact that people from gym class can instantly be very aggressive, knowing full well that they're really in the zone of anything that's sports related. And considering that Ryan's sports related material is skating, which is something that she can't do during the winter, so she ends up going inside the gym. I honestly felt like that there was not a single place on this planet that has an indoor skating room, not really skating room, but a skateboard room. Well, Ryan can skate inside. Granted, it may have, but it had different elements that centered around other characters from this show. Granted, this episode isn't one of the best from this show, like there are other episodes that are superior than this, but when it comes to Season 2, it's underrated at most. All the Wage, on the other hand, I can do without. Believe me when I say this. It tries, but at the same time, the execution is what's dragging the try part away. Especially the scene where Liam screams like a god in one of the lagos. That scene alone is desperation on trying to make this episode try hard, but at the same time, doing the opposite of try hard. And the fact that Throwing Pains didn't try hard to be funny, and it ended up becoming more funnier than All the Wage. So I'm giving the Loud House's All the Wage a 5 out of 10, while the Casagrandes Throwing Pains gets a 7.5 out of 10.